Hi, I'm Elaine. Welcome to my podcast channel.
How different it is from place to place. So that we have a system where you can have high schools or middle schools that are quite close to one another that have very different resources. So I've been interested in that and interested in figuring out how this situation can be changed to be more equitable.
Because I noticed that especially in the US, there's this wealth disparity amongst schools, and the very good schools are really good, but the underprivileged schools, there's lack of funding as well. So do you think that in underprivileged schools in general, do they need more mathematical educational support?
I think there's lots of different types of support depending on what community that you're talking about, and sometimes also even we have, especially after the pandemic, we have a real shortage of math teachers. So we sometimes are recruiting math teachers from people who have expertise in different fields. And I think that is an issue, and resources are an issue. And in some communities, it's lack of food, nutrition, healthcare all plays into this. So it's not simply what happens in the school, but just we have disparity in so many dimensions.
Right.
But math is one of them, and that if math education if the expectations for students are low at a school, or there aren't very many opportunities to learn math at a school. For instance, some schools teach calculus, teach multivariable calculus, teach linear algebra. There are other schools that, one of my students came from a school where they never talked about logs.
At university?
No, at high school. I came across a student at the university.
Oh, okay.
Who had never seen a log or trig in high school because it wasn't offered in his high school.
Oh, wow.
He did become a physicist, which was wonderful.
That's amazing.
But that was a very, very hard road. And it shouldn't be that hard. So there are inequities in terms of opportunities, and also in terms of how one goes about learning math, or whether it's assumed that people can learn math or are good at it. Where I would put all of those things in quotes. Because can learn math, I believe anybody can learn math.
Yeah.
And people who work at it harder and who are taught better often feel like they're better at it, when that might not be really. What does it mean to be good at it? So there's also in some schools, you can do math at the expectation levels by just mimicking what the teacher is telling you. So you see a bunch of problems, you do a few like it, you're tested on exactly those, and it doesn't really result in learning, even if the students are working hard doing what they're told to do. And then other schools, it's much more of a sense-making activity, and students are asked to engage more.
Yep.
So I think that's a difference. I'm curious, so I know that there's some research that has been done in Vancouver,
Yeah.
Yes.
Vancouver. Yeah.
Excuse me?
There's research, in Vancouver, British
Right.
Columbia. Yeah.
Right. That Lildajal wrote a book on building thinking classrooms that some of my students from Ontario have said that their teachers have had trainings in that, and that's changed the way that they've taught math. I'm curious, in your math classes, how is math taught?
That's a really good question, actually. So of course, I took a lot of math courses through high school, and I think the similarities between my math classes is that there's a lot of discussion and less of the teacher teaching. So it's like more me interacting with my peers and writing on whiteboards of what we think, for example, how to solve a quadratic, and then we would probably write on a whiteboard. So whiteboards are very prevalent throughout my classroom experience. And so I come up with 3 or 4 methods to solve one problem, and we often discuss, so what's another method to solve the same problem? So there's lots of discussion. I think discussion is quite popular in my math classes, but I don't really know about the US. Like maybe students just copy down notes from the teacher. I'm not really sure.
So, yes, so it would be wonderful if we had much more of that. Yeah. In some math classes, this happens, but in too many of the schools where in too many schools of all different kinds in the US, students aren't engaged at the whiteboards, and they, for instance, just this week, I was asked by a school district that's a very good school district in a quite well-to-do town near where I live, if I could talk about the work that Lildajal did in Canada. Yeah. With the vertical erasable surfaces and students working on them in obviously random groups, and in order to try and change some of the dynamic of the teacher lecturing to the students and the students remembering what the teacher told them. And that. So I think that there are in some schools, there have been a lot of efforts to change things, to make it more like what you're used to, more discussion that people are involved in, where you have some agency, and you're trying to figure something out, and you're talking to your peers. But that is not the usual. It's not the run-of-the-mill math class here. And there have been numerous attempts over the years to change things. And that old system seems very sticky. That people kind of revert back to what they're used to and what the role of the student to sit and listen and the role of the teacher used to be. And then even as things change, as there are attempts to change things, it's a very conservative system. And that's one of the things that I actually really like about this idea of having a lot of vertical whiteboards or blackboards around the room, because it encourages more thinking and talking and problem solving.
Yeah.
But that's not a standard part of most math classes.
So referring to math classes, do you mean high school math classes or
high school math classes? At university, we are doing that in many of our calculus classes. We have small classes, but there are still at many universities, it's still taught as a lecture. And in fact, one school that I was looking at for my son, a lot of subjects were taught in small classes with discussion. And so I, being a math teacher, which they didn't know, said, what about math? Is that taught in small classes where you discuss? And I was hoping the answer would be yes. And the answer was no, because in college, they need to learn to take a lecture. And I thought, well, not in my college, and that seemed such a shame that calculus was taught as a lecture at that particular school on purpose, because they thought that they were prepping those kids for university.
Yes.
There's lots of things that don't, to me, make a lot of pedagogical sense. So you had written in your email that you were, that some kids felt like they could do math and some kids felt like they couldn't, right?
Yes. So what I found from my environment that I grew up with is that I'm in a girls' school, so a lot of girls, they don't really like math. They prefer the arts. And some girls, or students, I would say mostly, they chose the math pathway in order to gain monetary advantages, like become rich, and then they can specialize in economics and be a CEO. Like, I think they think that math is the foundation of STEM, and then through that foundation they could make money. I would say money is a lot of people's conceptual success right now, and I think that not a lot of people learn math just for fun or just to discover more about what is real and what is false. I think that they learn something for a specific purpose or target. I do math because of something else. So I was wondering, yeah.
So have you read Lockhart's The Mathematician's Apology?
I don't think I've read this book before.
Let's see if I can find it and send you a link, because I think you'd like it.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a very different take on math. It's a take on math, that math is an art form. Mathematician's Lament. There it is. Hang on 1 second, and I think it's coming up.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to put this in the chat.
Great.
Let's see. Is this more options? No, is this the chat? Where is the chat? You at where? Oh, I see. Now I just got talking to me.
Yeah. I'm not really sure. It's my first time really using Google Meets, but
this is Google Meets, not Zoom, so there might not be a chat. Okay. I am going to go. I'm still here, right?
Yep.
Okay. I don't see you for a second, but I am. Okay. I have just sent you. Now let me see if I'm back. Now I'm back. Okay.
Yeah.
I have just sent you the link by email.
Okay. Yep.
Because there are very many different ways to think about math, I actually myself got interested in it not as a tool at all. There was a long time ago when I was in fourth grade, after Sputnik launched. So Sputnik was a Russian spaceship, and the US decided, whoops, we're behind. We need to improve our math education. So there was a new curriculum called the New Math that was very abstract. And I learned that in fourth grade, and I loved it. I remember that the teacher first wrote the word tree on the board and said, "What's this?" We said, "It's a tree."
Yeah.
He said, "No, it's not a tree. The tree's out the window. This is a collection of letters that make up a word, and it stands for tree." And then he drew a tree. He said, "What's this?" We said, "Well, that's a tree." He said, "No, that's a picture of a tree. That's not a tree. The tree's still outside. This is another way of representing the tree." And we made up our own number systems. We did things in different phases. And most parents and many teachers thought it was just ridiculous. I loved it. We only did it for that year, and very soon, so it was a nationwide thing, and very soon it went away because people thought it was too abstract. But then I didn't start to love math again. I liked geometry because I could draw pictures. Yeah. But then in college, when I saw that you could solve beautiful things, I started to think it was aesthetically really pleasing. And I decided that that's what I wanted to do for that reason. And quite the contrary to what you were saying is the standard where you are. Is my father, when I said, "I'm going to study mathematics," said, "Well, okay, but I don't know what you're going to do with that."
Yeah, the same as what my mom said to me. She doesn't think that pure math could lead you anywhere because it's too existential and pure, and you might have to just stare at a piece of paper every day. So yeah, similar situation.
Yes, there are many things that you can do. And also it's beautiful. And problem solving, I think there's also kind of a mental mindset that you eventually need, that you might need to work very hard at something, and it might not make sense for a day, for 2 days, for a month, and then you feel so good when it all of a sudden does.
Yes.
But you need to be patient, and I think that's also something that is not, it seems like it would be more taught to students the way that you're being taught. We have to figure stuff out, and you might not figure it out right away. But if you're just being told, then, so I once asked my students in a seminar, so they were students at all different levels of mathematics, how long might you work on a homework problem if you didn't feel like you were getting closer to the answer? And students who are taking the most elementary courses, 10 minutes max.
Yep.
And students taking the more advanced courses, it was hours or days.
Yeah.
And I think, and which courses they were taking, because they were all freshmen, it completely reflected what they had been exposed to before. their interests too, but also they were in my seminar, so they all had some interest in math. But more likely what they had done before and what they thought about it. And I also would ask students sometimes at the beginning of the class, they'd say, okay, that part of the room, go stand near there if you think of math as a science. And near here if you think of it as more of an art. And then we try different dimensions, an art or a language or and the only people who picked art were the people who had seen a lot of math in high school. Because they were the ones who went to high schools that had really good math programs, and they were able to see some beautiful things. And the people who were taught in a very rote way, there was no art to see. So I thought that was interesting as well.
Right. Especially the deeper you go, the more questions there is. For example, the PMP problem, or I also heard about the monstrous moonshine classification of finite simple groups. I think it's in high school you might learn about all the way to the third dimension, and some of my friends are asking, oh, how about the fourth dimension or fifth dimension, and maybe higher dimension, like 196,884 or something, but multiple dimensions. And high school teachers, sometimes they just neglect the question of how about the fourth dimension, or what is the fourth dimension, because they only need to teach the Cartesian plane or just the third dimension in general. And that is how you basically manipulate numbers and solve problems. So I think that even though the fourth dimension was an unnecessary digression of topic, but I think it's still necessarily needed to be answered. I would say that it's important to discover more.
And to realize that there are some big questions that you can think about.
Yeah, it's just so substantial and so many things to discover. And I would say that not one person knows everything about math.
No.
Yeah.
Not at all.
And math is sort of like a tree too, with many, many branches. And I normally classify different mathematical topics, such as like the tree branches, I would say, and like groups. They're so vastly different. Yeah. So I think it's such a broad topic. And I was also wondering, since it seems that you support a lot of high school students, and you are, of course, a very observant math teacher, are there any projects that you did that supported mathematical education at underfunded schools, such as, do you teach them courses?
So I worked with the Cambridge Algebra Project. That's Bob Moses's project, which had a certain sort of perspective. So Bob Moses he passed away about a year and a half ago. He was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 60s. So he led voter registration among African Americans, in particular in the South, in sharecropping communities, where there was a lot of inequity in many, many, many ways. Yeah. So, like, we're about today's Saturday, on Monday, we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday here. And some historians say that Moses was the in that whole movement was the most important person that nobody ever heard of. Many people heard of him, but if you're sort of outside of that one little, he's not real well known. But he was a math instructor before he started devoting a lot of time to the civil rights movement. And then he became a math instructor again in Tanzania, I believe, and came back and started the Algebra Project, saying that once a community has the vote, in order to get more economic, and in this way it ties in with your classmates' viewpoints, in order to get more economic resources, that not being taught math was a violation of the civil rights. Not having a good math education put you in a position where it really limited your opportunities. So I worked with the Algebra Project, working with teachers, working with students, in sort of many different ways. I also worked with the Educational Development Center in an odd way. I would teach teachers classes while they would do professional development through the EDC. And that was so fascinating, because I would just come in and I teach the teachers' classes, but I keep on revisiting the same classes. So I got to know the classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I would sometimes, usually I'd come in and I'd just do something fun. So we did a little group theory in the calculus class. Had nothing to do with what they were doing, but we did symmetries of an equilateral triangle, and how would you do a symmetry group table? Was this operation, were all the symmetry operations commutative? Were there subsets that really were commutative? And then there was a class that was a trig class. And I was going to do one thing with them, and they saw the little triangles, and they really liked that. So I said, okay, you want to do this, whichever project you want. And they did that as well. And even though I thought it was quite interesting that even though they were considered a very low-level math class, because kids weren't really invested in learning math, they were quite invested in problem solving. And they felt freer to experiment because they didn't think of themselves as being always right. The calculus students thought of themselves as people who are always right, and they were so scared to do anything because I was just sort of throwing this out and saying, try and come up with something. So it was very interesting in terms of what's taught and what engages students, that I found that the students who were deemed not very good in math were actually a little bit better at the math that I was doing than the students who were deemed quite good at it. So that was quite interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it said to me that we need to have more variety in our approaches to math, that it's really taught as a tool, sometimes only, and that may not be very interesting. So I've worked in that, and I also have worked with teachers to try and make the classrooms more engaging. In fact, I just taught a workshop last summer to people who were teachers. Well, some of them were tutors, but most of them were math teachers. and we read some of the work that was coming out of British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, as you mentioned, that maybe some people, students who are deemed to be not good at math, they tend to be better. I think it's kind of contradictory, but I think it makes sense in a way how they're more creative and they're not stuck into a box, because maybe people who are very deemed to be good at math, they follow a systematic pattern and they do what they're told to do. So that might be the reason.
It's hard. It's so hard to tell. I mean, yeah, I think it's partly the way that the discipline, the public face of the discipline, is very much, for some people, rule following.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not a rule follower, you might just dismiss it completely, not realizing that there's lots of room for creativity and for creating your own rules.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so part, I think, is the public face of the discipline, but another part is how people look at themselves. And also, what's your opinion on this? Why is it? I think this is true in Canada. It's definitely true here, that people often say, "Oh, I can't do math," and just that's a fine thing, seems for people to say, whereas nobody says, "Oh, I don't read."
Yeah. So personally, I think that there's two types of people. So one type of people, they're very humble. And because math is such a deep subject and there's so much to invest in, I think saying that I am good at math, it's sort of like putting you on a level that what if I can't solve this, then I am not good. So I think it's a self-protection mechanism, in which when they say it, it's sort of protecting themselves. If they fail at it, then, well, I just said that I'm not good at math, so it verifies my identity. But if they're good at it, then they kind of get some pride, or I would say mostly it's protecting themselves from criticism from other people. It's sort of like putting themselves at a lower level. And because math is such a hard subject, I think some of my peers say that too, even though I think they're pretty good. They say that, oh, I'm not good at math. Some people say that. And I think the second type of person, they say that they're not good at math because they might not have a strong foundation, such as maybe basic. I've been tutoring one of my peers at school. They have not yet grasped the fundamental algebraic solving, like x plus 1 equals to 2x, find x, and then they need more foundational skills. They haven't invested a lot of time in mathematics. Maybe a lot of reading English novels, but not a lot of reading math books or math-related ideas. So I think, the second type of person is more of a lack of foundation. But there's definitely more people saying, I think I'm not good at math is a pretty common phrase that I've heard from a lot of people. And personally, I wouldn't say that. I never say that I'm not good at math. And I never say that I'm really good at math. So I just don't say anything. But because no one's very good at math, because math is such a deep topic and you can't be absolutely good at math because you might fail. You might be very good at linear algebra, but not very good at real analysis or different topics. So can't.
And that's so similar to any other subject. Like, you wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm good at history," because what on earth could that mean? You might say, "I know a lot about the history of South America in the 20th century." You might say that,
Mm-hmm.
but you wouldn't say, "I'm good at history," because clearly there's too much for,
yeah.
But you also wouldn't hear people say, "I'm bad at history." They might say I'm bad at dates, but they never say I'm bad at history, because it doesn't seem like a thing that you could be good or bad at. You know some things and you don't know others. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's especially, I think I'm bad at math is a more common quote from people nowadays than I'm bad at other things.
Yes.
Yeah.
This, I think, has been true for a long time.
Yeah, I guess it's contagious. Yeah.
But I think also that sometimes if you feel that you are bad at it, then you wouldn't try too hard, which would make you worse at it. So it's sort of, it is self-fulfilling, and because it's a tall subject that builds upon itself, that once one has declared this, it's kind of hard to go back from it. And it's possible, but it's challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think also, I wonder how much of it is that if you get a wrong answer, it's marked wrong. And if you write a problematic essay, it's not marked wrong. There are comments on it, but it's not marked wrong.
Right. And that is the fundamental difference between arts and math. Even math is an art, but I think that's a difference between English and math, just to say. English is probably more, according to my opinion, I think that I can argue that. But math, as opposed to English, it's unarguable because the right one's right and the wrong one's definitely wrong. You can only choose one. And so I think that's the right and wrong. And also I think that is what I really like about math, is because it's so definite and it's less vague. It's sort of like this black and white kind of thing, as opposed to in English or philosophy, we have the gray shades, and sometimes it's right but not entirely right and not entirely wrong. So I think that probably is the difference.
And so there's one mathematician, actually now he's doing something else, but a mathematician who became a president of the university, who has written a lot about learning from failure, so a successful failure. And he has his students write for credit. They need to write about something that some productive failure. And that what he would say is, if you're afraid to be wrong, you're not going to be very brave. And if you're not very brave, you have less chance of solving hard problems.
Yes, and I think especially I found a commonality between all mathematicians is that, including you as a great math teacher, I observe, is that everyone is really humble, and they kind of, even though mathematicians, like we would correlate mathematicians as the smartest humans on earth, but they kind of, because it's such a deep and complicated topic, we have to be brave to solve problems, so they kind of put the mask of prestige off their face. So it's like inventing and really just making mistakes themselves. So sometimes a lot of mathematicians, I find, they're really humble, actually. And even though I know a lot, but there's more to know. So I think that's a common characteristic. Yeah. And I think that you are also really humble. Yeah.
And I think also, just thinking about the pedagogy and going back to what I was saying at the beginning, that because here we have a lot of teachers, especially after the pandemic, we are missing hundreds of teachers at in school districts, many of whom are math teachers. But if you have to teach a subject that you feel you lack a lot of confidence in, that can lead to wanting to just not wanting students to experiment because it's hard. You need a deeper knowledge in order to guide a productive discussion than you do to say, here, just do this and everything will be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And often there's other paths that would also be okay.
Yeah.
But if you're scared to walk down them because you've been asked to teach something that you don't feel comfortable thinking about, or you're afraid to be wrong, then that serves the students very poorly. If you're not afraid to be wrong, then it could actually be fine. A very humble mathematician who won a Fields Medal once was telling me that he had his Japanese Professor Hironaka. He was saying he had a teacher in high school who didn't know what he was doing, but he actually learned the most in that class because that teacher was honest with everybody and said, I just don't know how to do this. And that made us all try hard.
Yeah.
So it really depends on how what somebody does with what they know or don't know. It's such an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree, especially teachers. I think it kind of sparks more people to invest their energy in solving it because, oh, my teacher doesn't even know, then if I know, then it validates me as something. So I think that's a motivator. Yeah. Another question for me would be, so at university, do you think that high schools, how high schoolers, they transition to university? I mean, our students at Harvard mostly really genius, where they're math classes, are they all really good at the same level approximately, or there's a wide difference?
There's all different. There's not homogeneity. There's lots of difference in lots of classes. And I think often people start coming in by thinking everybody is genius level except for them. And that's why lectures are not a good idea, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because, or at least having students work independently always is not a good idea. Because, as you said, solving problems can be hard. And if you're doing it alone and having trouble, you're thinking nobody else is having any trouble at all. That's just a human thing to think.
Yeah.
Especially if you're at a prestigious place.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're working together with other people, yes, you might say, whoa, that's somebody who knows a lot, but you're going to also be working with people who are struggling with the same thing. And sometimes as you explain to one another what you're thinking, you can come up with some new understandings. But you definitely don't feel like you're the only one, because you realize that everybody in the class is a human.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, are there students at Harvard potentially who don't know how to solve logarithms, or that's like the basic everyone knows?
No, there are students who, especially now that we've just come off of a pandemic, where in some schools, I mean, I had one student in my seminar, I was asking everybody what their math class was like during the pandemic.
Yep.
And she said, my math teacher died at the beginning of the pandemic. Hi, you disappeared.
Yeah, I just suddenly disappeared. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
You were saying that
So I was saying I was going around the room saying,
Yeah.
What was math like at your school during the pandemic? So some students said, oh, all the end of year exams were canceled, so we could do really fun, interesting stuff, and we weren't stressed out, and it was great. And then another student said, well, my math teacher died at the beginning of the pandemic, so we never had math.
Mm-hmm.
And I know locally, some math classes were meeting once a week.
Right.
And then people were sitting in their homes doing their math homework. And in some cases, I think standards it was so hard to say you've got to do this, when there was a lot of chaos for some people. I think in many places, not everybody had a computer.
Yeah.
How are you going to do? I don't know what you are used to. Here, I think people are not used to reading a math textbook. It's a whole different way. Like, you don't read a math textbook the way that you would read a novel, right? So if there weren't class meetings, and it wasn't quite clear what was happening, and especially if, for instance, you learned logs by reading what were some log rules, and then that was it, how much is going to stay with you?
Probably just gonna forget about the rules the next day if you don't use it. Yeah.
So you remember that there was something where subtraction turned into division and multiplication turned into addition. That level of detail is going to get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I
So
totally agree.
I think it's people are coming in from in all different places. How did the pandemic impact your learning? What happened in your high school?
Yeah, so for me, for grade 9, I went to a public high school, and so that was during the pandemic, around 2020 or whatever. And so for my math class, the teacher would normally just record the meeting. So one week there was only 30 minutes of material. So I self-studied a lot and I was pretty ahead. So I don't think that affected me a lot. But I think for my friends or peers who struggle with math, they had really great difficulties. Especially when it comes to tests, because they just don't have enough time to interact with other people and solve problems. So I think, and that happens for public schools. So in Canada, there's public schools and private schools. And so for public schools, there's definitely not enough time to study math and not enough teaching time. Yeah, I think that is the biggest impact for the pandemic. But for private schools, I think they have additional teaching time. Yeah, and I think that is sort of what happens. So then for the next year, I transferred to a private school, and I think that there's more focus of basically the teacher-student interactions, and there's a huge disparity regarding education in Canada, if you just consider about private schools and public schools. So it's a huge gap here, and I think that, yeah, so the pandemic definitely didn't affect the private schools because they can function normally themselves, but definitely for public schools, a huge reduction of educational time. Yeah, people would normally go to school for just 2 hours every day and go back home. So
but schools were open?
Yes, the school is open from 8 to 3 p.m. But for example, if I were a student at a public school, I might just go to school for 1 or 2 hours every day. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a huge problem.
So here, a lot of schools shut down completely. In my town, it shut down. There wasn't, you could have a Zoom class, but that was it. And that was particularly challenging. So suppose you're a teacher and you've got 5 and 6-year-old kids. They're at home during the pandemic and they're supposed to be logging into their classes. So you're supposed to be on a computer. Your kids are supposed to be on different computers. This is a lot of computers for a household, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so, and how do you get a 5-year-old to interact with his or her kindergarten class on a computer while you are teaching? You can't.
Right.
That's impossible. So you teach less because that's the only way. Yeah. So it's really a mess.
Yeah.
And all childcare closed down.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I was also wondering, definitely, if Harvard is, or other universities in the US, is supporting underprivileged schools by funding the schools, especially maybe public schools.
They're not funding them. They're not funding them. They're trying to take the best students from those schools and give them a chance. But they're not funding them. There are some programs for kids, particularly in Cambridge, that bring some high school kids in the summer. It's a Crimson Academy. And MIT has some programs also in the summer, countrywide, to bring students in from under-resourced schools. But the colleges are not funding those schools. Yeah, they need a little bit of a rehaul.
Yeah, so personally, do you think that colleges should fund a lot of underprivileged schools, or alternatively?
See, a lot of small colleges right now are in pretty bad financial shape. So the small ones don't have, like, they're struggling to exist. My son's college just swallowed up a little college nearby us. Campus in Boston. Like, my mother is living in an apartment in a college that shut down. It shut down quite a while ago, but so I think what they're doing instead, I mean, it's an interesting question as to where this money would be best used and how. What they're doing instead, what Harvard is doing is, if parents earn under a certain amount, you don't have to pay to come. So the student can come for free. So for numerous students, it was their cheapest option for college was Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they're doing. But then, so one of the things that I've been doing is I started an emerging scholars program, which the university is going to sort of take over in a slightly different form next fall, but to make sure that those students who are the top students from under-resourced schools and who come to Harvard wanting to study something in STEM, but come not fluent with pre-calculus material, with logs and trig, and have a path forward and have some encouragement, both a path forward and encouragement that just because you don't know this material yet doesn't mean that you can't learn it every bit as well as anyone else. So that's what I've been spending some time and energy on. But there's still some students, but again, particularly after the pandemic, have come in and said that I'm not getting an A. That's okay. Because this may take time, but I'm used to getting all A's. So it's, sort of, who am I if I'm not excelling? And having conversations about, we didn't start on a level playing field, so we're not going to get there immediately. It may take a little time. But that's hard. Right? So, but if that isn't done, if there isn't something to kind of support students in getting from where they are to where they want to be, then it seems that you're not really doing a service to some of the students by saying, come join us. If you're then not saying that journey that they're going to take is going to be okay, that that's a perfectly reasonable journey. So those, I think, are some of the challenges that we're having at the university. And I'm really glad that the university is now going to sort of try and take over some kind of something that makes that journey, if you did come from an under-resourced school and therefore didn't have all the opportunities, that you can still end up where you want to be.
Right. And I think that the current problem in our world really is a huge educational disparity, and some people might not even have the opportunity to get an education, or people in the US, they don't know other countries except for the US. They just don't know what's out there. And I think that is just really sad. And I was wondering, do you think that through more funding or just money circulation would solve this problem?
I think I have two thoughts. And they might seem inconsistent, but I don't think they are.
Yeah.
Simply throwing money into a system doesn't always do the trick. So if you want to look at a case study, you can look at the Newark, New Jersey school system, which had a ton of money thrown into it, but it got dissipated somehow. And I've had a bunch of students who've come from there and said, it didn't kind of trickle down to how we were being taught. So simply money is not quite enough. Because, if you think about what we were saying before, there's some research that says that there'll be more equity and less people thinking, oh, I don't belong in this class, if there are more activities like what's happening in your math classes, where people get up together in groups and work together on problem solving. But if the teachers don't feel comfortable, they feel like that would lose control of the classroom, and then how will anything work? No one's going to be engaging. I need to tell them what to do. I need to keep control. Then it doesn't really matter how much money you put on that, unless you can, and also even just learning to teach like that, that's a change. You need to be able to support teachers in learning to teach differently. And in some cases, it would be in getting more experience with the subject matter, right? So if some of those funds could go to that, often funds end up being things like you buy a lot of computers, but if you don't know how to use a lot of computers in a way that promotes thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and you just learn push this button, push that, that's not teaching any lasting skills. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, giving money to support students' education, that is and we'd have to distinguish what's the difference between that and what I was just saying doesn't always work. But that there is a lot of research that says that an investment in an under-resourced child's education pays itself back completely. Like it's the most financially productive investment that can be made, because it can change the whole trajectory of a life. So I think sometimes money is given to a system that doesn't really end up
at the right place.
The individuals in the system. And I think if you could really improve teaching in a way that empowers the students to learn better, then by putting money into improving teaching, those teachers will have hundreds and hundreds of students. So that would be a big impact. But I think just saying more money and not saying how it's used and what it's used for, that we've had people who meant very well spend a lot of money to not improve the system.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's sometimes the money gets dissipated into other things, such as paying other people just for monetary gains, or I think a lot of people nowadays say money is kind of this want or this essential that a lot of people think is important to their lives, instead of improving, the, as you mentioned, this more intangible intellectual concepts. There's less investment into that. So I think, it's important to distribute money to the right place, and maybe pressing the buttons, but knowing what it's for. And I was also wondering if you could distribute very good teachers. As you mentioned, there's not a lot of good teachers, regardless of whether you dump a lot of money into the system. So maybe Harvard could distribute its own teachers, or how their system really teaches a lot of people, like across the country.
That's a really interesting notion. For instance, in Japan, you might be assigned to one school for 3 years, and then you move to another school for 3 years in another school. And that's just part of what being a teacher is. Whereas here, you're in the school, and then if you're, it's usually the last hired, first fired, or first moved. But there isn't deliberate attempt. Like if people say, oh, here's a community that's doing well with their math education, it's a non sequitur here to say, oh, well, let's take some of those teachers and move them to this place.
Yep.
And there's also another problem that I'd be interested to know whether this is true where you are as well. Often the top teachers, the most engaging teachers, the most energetic teachers, and often the most knowledgeable teachers teach the upper level classes. And students are tracked. And I have one good friend from high school, and she would always insist on teaching lower level classes and some upper level because she liked that, but say, no, I'm not going to just teach the kids who would probably learn whether they had a good teacher or not. But that's rare. Often the least experienced teachers are put in the classes where the students need the most motivation and the most help.
Right.
And there's also tracking here, which I think, so the top teachers are often put in the top track. And how much of that is, there's many things that could contribute to that, but that just reinforces this very artificial hierarchy. And that's not really equitable. Is there tracking in your school?
I don't think so, but I think that, so my school, it's sort of, more of a congregation of people who have money, but also they recruit students who transfer to the school who are quite competitive or not academically outstanding. So not a lot of tracking at my school, but there's definitely not enough of governmental funding for public schools or underprivileged schools, because in Canada, I think compared to the US, there's not much of a wealth gap in Canada. It's more evenly distributed. But I think there's an educational gap definitely for public and private schools. So governments still fund public schools, but the teachers, because I have experience for both public and private schools, for public schools, the teachers are more lazy, I would say. Sometimes they would just put on a YouTube video and we sit there and watch a YouTube video for the whole class without doing anything. And then we just leave. Before private schools, the teachers are required to teach new materials every single class. So, yeah, I think that is what happens here in Canada as opposed to the US.
So are they private schools quite expensive?
Right. They're not that expensive, but you have to pay. I think they are quite expensive, but for people who are financially, they're sort of like Harvard University. People at a normal income level, they have to still pay to get into Harvard if they get accepted, of course. But people who are have lack of income or below the average income level, they could just come in for free. Like I have a friend, she just came to my school for free and she didn't need to pay for anything. Well, first because her family doesn't have enough financial gains, and second because she's really outstanding and competitive. Yeah. So she got in. So it's sort of like how Harvard University works.
Right, yes. Yeah. Sounds similar.
Yeah, definitely. But I think a lot of people at my school, I just hope that how do you really inspire more people into math? Because I developed a math club, and I try to inspire more people to like math because I think it's actually a very fun subject. It's just, yeah, I think, do you have any tips for that?
Yes. I mean, I think, again, I think some ways it like doing puzzles and things like that seem to be things that people love to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are books of kind of mathy puzzles and yeah, things that problems where it doesn't matter exactly what courses you've taken, everybody's sort of on the same page. Yep. I think that makes it fun. And something that shows kind of the beauty of math. Mm-hmm. What do you notice? What do you wonder about? Those are good kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And then other people, what intrigues them is what you can do with it. So it really depends on, what people like. But
yeah,
are there math circles in Canada?
Yep. So there's the UBC Math Circle. So UBC is a university in Vancouver, yeah. And I'm part of the UBC Math Circle. I just signed in for it. I think I'm going in a few days, and I think there's a lecture and also a group discussion. So we take courses from like professors at UBC, and for an hour, and for the other half hour or so, we discuss competition questions or puzzles or just math questions in general with different math motivated students. Yeah, so I'm part of the UBC Math Circle, and I think that is really, I anticipate for the experience because I think it's important to actually talk about math with other people. It's more of an interactive process instead of just closing in and doing math yourself, because like over many years of solving math problems, I think there's always more than one way for a problem to be solved. So yes. Open to more ideas. Yeah. But what's your favorite math book?
Oh, I don't think I have one favorite. Yeah. I think I have a favorite.
Yeah.
What's your favorite?
Mm-hmm. Which one are you reading right now, like currently?
Right now, well, I was just rereading, because I'm teaching, because of what I'm teaching, I was just rereading part of Story of a Number, a little bit of math history of mathematics. And Trigonometric Delights. Wow. And again, both of these I've read before, but I wanted to refresh what I could bring to the class in terms of history.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds really interesting. Because I talked to, do you know Mr. David Bogan? I think he's a math teacher at MIT. Do you know him personally?
No, I don't.
I think he also talked about the history of mathematics, and I think he recommended that book for me too. Haven't read it before, but is it complicated to grasp?
No, I can tell you two funny stories. So one of those books, I was renting a home, an apartment with 3 other people who I did not know. And I went actually, this is very funny. I went to Seattle and I rode my bike to Vancouver and then came back. So I was in, this is my only time in Vancouver. I loved it. And I came back, and two of the people that I lived with said, so I had all my books, on bookshelves in the house.
Yeah.
Said, "Oh, I read that book of yours, Story of a Number. That was good." And then another person, of these three random people who I lived with, said, "Oh yeah, I read that one too. Yeah, I'm glad you left it out here." So that, it wasn't, neither one, I think, would call themselves mathematician. They were just fascinated. And then the trigonometric delights, that was funnier. I was visiting a friend who was starring in The Lion King, the play.
Yeah.
He was Mufasa. And he was putting on a play in a theater company that he ran for little kids at the same time that he was acting on Broadway. So he was putting Macbeth into ancient Egypt. And I was reading Trigonometric Delights, and I said, as he was talking to me about the hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, I said, "Do you know how they did fractions? Fractions, they started with 1/. He said, "How do you know this?" I said, "Well, I'm reading it right now." And he borrowed that book, and it was so hard to get it back from him because this is just so interesting. So I would recommend it because lots and lots of people with very, very different amounts of math knowledge have found them fascinating.
Yeah,
it's by Eli Mayor. Maor.
Yeah. Yeah, sounds really interesting. Might look into that.
Yeah, it's just, it's fun, it's interesting. With E, there's so much they don't know. Like, where did E come from? Is E Euler's number? Did he have something? There's so much that just nobody really knows for sure. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I was always wondering, like, since from a young age, what does cosine really even mean? How did the number even exist at the first place? So been asking myself these questions.
That, I think, I'm not sure sine and cosine from complementary angles, right?
Yeah.
The sine of alpha is the cosine of the complementary angle to alpha.
Yeah.
But a lot of that was used to try and do navigation, like how far were things, how tall were objects, trees, and surveying in order to collect taxes. They surveyed people's land using a lot of trigonometry. So it's a very old, so trigonometry, did you learn trig with a unit circle or with triangles or with both?
With triangles mostly, yeah.
Okay, yes, historically that's how they started, although if you're thinking of trig, now a lot of trig is used because it's periodic. So for periodic, if you're modeling heartbeat or a lot of biological or seasonal things, tides, music, sound waves. Well, Fourier series, you can model lots of different
the combination of sine and cosine curves or whatever.
Yeah, combinations of sine and cosine. So that kind of feels like it comes more from the unit circle definition. But the first uses of trig were very much embedded in that triangle. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think I previously, I was deciding to look into Fourier analysis. I found it reading just the Fourier analysis. I think it was one by Alia Steen. Fourier analysis. And I found it quite complicated, but very interesting, definitely. Yeah. I think Fourier analysis, is it one of the harder courses at university. Definitely, it was kind of complicated to grasp. So I think you're definitely right. Reading math books, it's really hard to read a math book yourself and knowing everything. You have to have a helper.